Just so, Diffenwell added. But, there is strife still in that kingdom. Though the lady is a fine ruler, she is surrounded by enemies, Wales, Northumbrian Elmet and Cumbraland. Even Eothwick, whose leaders are being threatened with Norse again. He looked across to her. Are you quite well? Osrith had stopped and was staring at him. She was not, but she carried on walking anyway. Just a little dizzy. May we go back? Diffenwell nodded, and touched her shoulder as Osrith turned. I think that it is not a bad suggestion, Osrith admitted. Are there no other princesses closer to you? Osrith meant geographically, rather than spiritually. Although who was she to judge if Elfwin and Diffenwell would be a good match or not? You were in Irian once, were you not? He asked. Yes, Osrith nodded, and withdrew away from her scabbard with a clean, SEHRMMM, which made Diffenwell laugh, a little nervously. You know of Domhnall Uineal, the king of the Ailch? Osrith nodded. I once met him, when I was very young. When I was taken by Angus to Dunnottar. He was an exile then. I won this from him. We were at Tara, to watch the High King choosing, and Malmuir's wedding. Ah, yes. Diffenwell nodded. They have those very rarely these days. The Norse in Car, there is infighting which spills into civil war. I believe you must have visited Irian at a good time for the country. You got your blade from there? Diffenwell asked. I won it from Domhnall, in a fighting competition, Osrith told him, and he hated that I did. Yet, we grew to be good friends. And she realized that Diffenwell had stopped walking. Osrith stopped too, and waited for the king to say what he wanted to. Bastard Gales, Diffenwell cursed, automatically. But, if I recall the time, then you must have known Muir's son with her first husband, he ventured. Neil, Osrith exclaimed, as she recalled the young boy, dedicated to the natural world, the dirtiest child she had ever known, always playing in mud or dirt and water, kind, thoughtful, brave. Osrith recalled, on the day that the Norse invaded, when she had directed Mary to take the children quietly back to the Doire palace. Then, you knew his sister, Land, Diffenwell told her. Land. The name was not familiar and, as Diffenwell pulled on the gate that led them between the ramparts and the palisade wall. No, wait, she changed her name to something Gaelish, as your mother changed hers to a Saxon name, Diffenwell added, playing for time so that his brain might spit out the name. Eventually, he said, Gormleth. I only ever met her once, and she was rather tall, thin, like my father. Really? My Aunt Land. Diffenwell broke off when Osrith gasped loudly. He looked down to her stomach, but Osrith was not touching her bump. Her hand was at her mouth. Gormleth. You knew her? Gormleth, Osrith repeated. How could she have forgotten her? Tall, thin, quiet. If talking was needed, she let Ira or Mary do it. Gormleth was a little older than Osrith and remembered them all going to the monastery, learning the while she looked after Neil and the two other princes. Eochaid's daughter? Osrith asked, wondering how it was she did not know that about Gormleth. But then she did not know a lot of things, and national feeling ran as deep between Dalriata, Pitland and Strathclyde as it did between Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Wales. Gormleth was treated badly by those Gaels. Diffenwell spat, as he showed Osrith into the passage down which the kitchens were, for some food. Malmuir adopted her into their household at Doire, and she let her be bargained to the King of Munster, never asking my father, for he was a Briton. Diffenwell continued, his voice hostile. And when she was not able to produce a child, Flansinna sold her to one of the Allied princes, until they had had enough of her. I was so angry when I knew, Diffenwell said, holding open the kitchen door so Osrith could get past. Instantly, the servants within stopped what they were doing and bowed their heads. My friends, he said to them, waiting for them to go about their duties, which seemed to Osrith to be filling up the big kitchen table with food. Neil found her wandering as a beggar, and in his kindness, married her, to keep her safe, even though she was much damaged and no children can come of their union. Osrith nodded. She had heard the story before but, listening to it told by her relative, and realizing she was Gormleth's relative too, it left a deep mark in her mind. You are angry, Osrith said. I am, too. I knew her. And even if I hadn't, to be treated like that when she went there for protection. You have heard the story before? Diffenwell asked, his bright blue eyes on hers. Osrith nodded. But it seemed like you needed to share it. And her cousin smiled, before pulling her to him for a moment. Eat, Diffenwell said, placing a kindly hand on Osrith's back. And please, rest. This is your last night here in my palace, and I would have you remember your kin. And Osrith did rest. She slept for most of the afternoon and woke when it was dark. In the room, a chill wind had found its way, and Osrith reached for her cloak. A candle had been placed in her room, and she managed to get to her feet, making towards the door. A guard had been placed by it, and when Osrith opened it, he turned to her, asking her to wait while he fetched one of her men, by which he meant Eswi or Phelim or Angus. And it was Eswi who came, concern in his face until he saw Osrith standing beside her door, waiting. There is to be a feast? Osrith asked, and Eswi nodded. It is where we are all now, he told her. Diffenwell said to bring you down if you wakened. Are you strong enough to be sociable? For a little time, Osrith told him, but if we are intending to leave at dawn I should get my rest, or I will be in no fit state to help you sail. You, help us sail? Eswi asked. Who is sailing? Osrith asked. Angus, he replied. He has the spirit of a gale. Even if he is a bastard Cymric, he will take us straight past Man to the very end of Hyrule kingdom, where we expect to find him. Osrith patted the seam where she had fixed Constantine's letter. Eswi helped Osrith down the steps to the hall of Diffenwell's palace. She had sat there, many years ago, with Eswi's brother, Tagged, Fergus, Constantine and Domhnall, listening as Eochaid wove them promises as fast as mists in their reliability, while Griogr planned to kill them all in their beds that night. So they had fled, to Ratlin, on the way to Doia. No such necessity to flee, Osrith told herself, as the walls, hung with skins of wolves and a huge one of a bear, was lit with many candles. At the top of the table sat Diffenwell, who was eating one huge thigh piece, presumably from a deer, and when he saw Osrith he got up, and welcomed her with enthusiasm to the table. Sit with Angus, he encouraged, and to one of the servants added, bring a plate. Bring meat. Angus, whose place seemed to have been taken by a huge man, pale hair as long as Diffenwell's, got up, but then stood still when he realized that it was his seat Angus was wanting. For the lady, Angus said to him, in Cymric. But the man just stared back at Osrith. For the slut, he replied, before sitting back down. Get up, Angus demanded. Don't you know I am the Mormor of this country? Don't you know I am Connor Mabtude? He asked, as if the name should have meant something to Angus. It may have, for Osrith saw Angus's face flicker, but before he could say anything, Diffenwell stood up and looked across to them. Connor, Diffenwell called. Shove up, you great big hinge. But the man was not moving, and Osrith, tired and wondering why she had decided to come at all, pointed to a settle over where Phelim was deep in conversation with Eswi. I can sit there, she said, but was ignored as Angus stepped across to the man. Diffenwell was also standing up. The men around him, presumably his lords, were all now looking at the Mormor they resented in one of their own. Osrith, cousin, Diffenwell called over to her. You may have my place, and you can tell the Lords Owain and Lou of your time in Mercia. But it never got that far. Connor, who had stood facing Angus, had now head-butted the man so hard he had fallen onto the floor, rolling in the straw as blood ran down his face and into his long, red beard. The Cymric man made a grab for Osrith, tearing at her jerkin, but the attack had no energy to it, and served only to make Osrith stagger. Mabtut, Diffenwell shouted, but he rounded back onto Osrith, who was holding on to the back of the settle with her weak, left hand. Slut, he called again, as Angus rolled on the floor, trying to get up. I was there when you stabbed Colleen. He was my friend, and you killed him. He made to swipe at Osrith, who managed to dart backwards in time, for she too would have been thrown to the floor. But Griogr paid you out. He leered at her, his voice triumphant. He liked the feel of your tits, and your cunt was very tight. How was it like to feel a man ride you? Did he tell you he got his cock in? Osrith bit back, scornfully. If he did, I felt nothing. Connor made to hit her again, but Osrith stepped forward, Tag's seeks in her hand, its blade at the man's stomach. Was he your kin? How bad you must have felt to see him taken down, a traitor to both Eochaid and Domhnall. Connor made to step forward but felt the blade. He went mad, in the end. Connor retorted, putting a hand round Tag's seeks, its blade cutting his fingers raw. The same will happen to Constantine if he had almost removed the blade from his ribs, but had not counted on Angus grabbing both of his legs, and he toppled over, onto the floor, where Angus sat on him, squarely. Constantine's man come to lord it over us, Connor screamed, scrabbling at Angus, who got off him, and soundly punched him in the stomach. Grunting, Connor rolled over, but managed to turn his head to Osrith. Is that the father of your brat? Do you even know? Oh, I know, Osrith shouted back, as the man was hauled away by two guards. Another appeared at her right, supporting her elbow. He is going to the dungeons, Diffenwell said, his voice at the side of her head. But I wish to speak to you, Osrith. He turned to a maid. Bring the lady some food, we will be in my chamber. And, blithely ignoring the frantic waving of arms from Eswe, Osrith followed her cousin from the hall. 88,888,888. I cannot forget what my man said to you, Diffenwell said to Osrith, and I offer you, cousin, my sincerest apologies. None are needed, Osrith replied. It is true that Griog kept me prisoner at Caeligwylid on behalf of King Guthard. A ploy by Domhnall, I think, to wed me to the man in order to gain the city. Indeed? Diffenwell looked intrigued. You married the man? I was sent before a priest and words were said between us, Osrith admitted. It is claimed the marriage had been set on paper. But, as far as I am concerned, there was no marriage, and Domhnall did not claim Caeligwylid. A look appeared on Diffenwell's face which Osrith had not seen before, and the king, with his customary light-heartedness, had given way to one more grave. So, it is true, he sighed. Guthard claimed it so, but you were gone from Alba, and I could never find out. Find out what? Whether you were my cousin, and if so, whether my cousin had finally reclaimed the citadel, our long-lost jewel. But Osrith did not follow. Caeligwylid? We called it Caeluel, Diffenwell explained. Long was it taken from us by the Romans, it passed into the hands of stewards, but it was always ours. We lost it, and had to move to Altclut, where we are now. Passed into myth. Our kingdom was split and Cumbraland was lost to the Angles, to Ida the Flame-Bearer and his kin. But I always hoped... We always hoped... All Strathclyders knew. He got to his feet. Osrith, he said, and his eyes were alight with hope, with happiness. I have prayed to God ever since I knew you were our kin that something good would come of our reunification, and it has. And the warning Angus had given to her, when they had arrived, began to trickle into her brain. Do not get caught up in a scheme of rebellion against Constantine. You are valuable, you are of worth to the king's cause. Cousin, I am tired, Osrith told Diffenwell suddenly, hoping it was enough to break his chain of thought. May I go to my room? We begin early tomorrow. But Diffenwell either was ignoring her, or else had not heard her. Instead, he was walking towards a table on which sat a parchment. Her parchment. You will be needing this, he said, and when you return, you will return to my harbour. He nodded towards the window, underneath which flowed the Clyde. I am sorry my man was rude to you. I had to know the truth, and now I do. Caeluel is ours again, ours. He reached for Osrith's hands, and she let him hold them. In his joy, he had tricked her for something which was out of her sphere of understanding. Her chance, her only chance, was to play along, and she quavered, which was not altogether an act. Diffenwell glanced at her, before leading her to his bed, and inviting her to sit. Osrith, cousin, Diffenwell said, the pure delight and happiness apparent in his words. Rest here, we can talk in the morning. We cannot. I leave in the morning, Diffenwell, she put in, determined for him not to talk just yet. I do not understand what you are saying, but I am pleased for you. I am. Do not deny you did not marry Guthard, she told herself, sharply, because the joy he is showing is because he thinks that you did. But her newfound cousin did not seem to be listening. Osrith, we can talk in the morning, or we can talk now, he enthused. Are you prepared to fight for Strathclyde? Putting aside your differences with my father, of course, he added. And there, Osrith was confused again, for she had never spoken more than a dozen words to Eochaid, and then that had been at the table below, when she had been there the last time. Eochaid, your father, son of Run? But Diffenwill shook his head. No, he replied, shaking his head. And it was then when Osrith realized who Diffenwill resembled. She did not know how she had made her way to the door, but when her back pressed to the planks of it, she stopped, raising a hand between them. I rather think you do know who my father is, or have worked it out, Diffenwill said to her slowly, a hint of menace in his voice. My mother, a Cymric woman, bore me, but it is Greogair who is my father, Giric to the bastard Picts. He glanced at the door. I am not royal though I am Cymric. I am not Urien's heir. He stood apart from Othrith, his eyes merry with pleasure that his plans had come together. And we will have this conversation tomorrow, for, unlike your three guardians, you will be remaining here, the last of Urien's line. He glanced at her stomach, the second to last, and smiled that winning smile. You will get the best care, when the time comes, and this child will then be king or queen. No, Osrith protested, trying to fight past Diffenwill, but he gripped her wrists and pulled her heavily towards the bed, forcing her to sit. My men will be on guard. You cannot get down to the river. There is a two-story drop and you will be killed. There are no other entrances or exits in this room. I am leaving now and will assure my Morma, and your two other warriors that you were overcome from the excitement and I offered you my room, which you graciously accepted. Then, in the morning, you will be so overcome by emotion at reaching the land of your mother that you are refusing to go to Highwell, but instead are intent on remaining here with us. Osrith just stared at the young king, as he merrily told her his plan. And a light illuminated in her mind as she watched him leave, and a key turn in the lock. Never tell your enemy your plan, for, no matter how good it is, there will be a weakness, and an informed enemy will now have time to find out what it is. You want my weapons? Osrith asked. Diffenwill laughed. They are of no use to you here, he replied, before treading the boards and opening the door, crossing out into the passageway with one triumphant glance back in Osrith's direction, before being locked behind her. It was no use thinking just yet. Osrith was tired, that was true, and she lay on Diffenwill's bed as she thought of all she had been told that day. Could she manage these people and be Queen of Strathclyde, and a threat to Constantine's Alba? It was absurd. But, what she did know was that he felt like home more than Mercia, more here than Alba. She could hear the sigh here, in the groaning of branches in a winter storm, or the susurrus of the air crackling around the high hills and across the surface of the Clyde. And though she would be leaving, one way or another, on the ship with Eswi, Phelim and Angus, Osrith knew she would be back to the land of her mother. 88,888,888. What was concerning Osrith when she woke before dawn, was the idea that she was married, even now, to Guthard. How did writing down that a marriage had taken place on a sheet of paper and adding it to a book mean that she and Guthard Harthknutson were unassailably one? She had not seen him for nearly 30 years and presumed him dead. But, alive he was and still ruling Caerleguilid, which showed, ultimately, how unimportant that citadel was to Mercia and to Alba, that it had appeared so low down on either Ethelred's or Constantine's list of priories. But still married to him? Osrith shook her head in the dark, dismayed. She could not give over any more thought to that now, though, for she needed to piss. There was a bucket in the corner, and presumably a maid would come to take it away at some point, which meant the door would be unguarded for a split second. She also needed to deduce a way out. Too keen to accept to stay, and Diffenwill would know that Osrith was not serious. Climbing out of the window was, as he had pointed out, even not pregnant, and Osrith would have sustained serious injuries if she fell. But she went to look anyway, and looked down at the thin strip of ground acting as a key between the fortress and the river. In the pre-dawn light the ship's single mast waved gently in the breeze. Stuck. Osrith sat there, wondering for a long time, before lying back down and closing her eyes. Where was the weak spot? What was the flaw? Why had he allowed her to keep her weapons? And Osrith thought, Diffenwell had let her keep her blade, no food or drink had been forthcoming, no servants to open the door. Was this it, then? Yield or starve to death? She heard it again. The first time had just been on the threshold of consciousness. This time, Osrith turned her head to the door, which she had already tried to pry open at their hinges. Lady? Yes, Osrith replied, the voice in Gaelish now not Cymric. Yes, I am Challen. I. A nervous pause. I tried to take your horse when you arrived last week. I am sorry you fell. The voice called. How can I get out of here? You can't. But you could open the door. Number. Then why offer me hope? I wanted to warn you, the man said, his voice quavering. Diffenwell wants you to be killed. He does not want you to challenge his kingship. But I do not challenge his kingship. By your very blood you do. What do you mean? There was silence. Challen? He wants you to birth that child and bring it up as his own. That child carries Arian's blood. It carries the blood of Coelhen. So he says. The bloodline of Sht. How was ever she to have known that the child could inherit a whole kingdom? It was no wonder Constantine had offered to raise him or her to control Strathclyde, meant to control the Irish Sea and all who entered it. No rogue king, but one whose blood was bred to it, and whose allegiance was wholly Gaelish. Osrith knew Constantine was clever, but this was above anything she had ever known. Challen, you have to get me out of here, Osrith called. I thank you for warning me. Osrith placed a hand on the door. Challen, no answer. Osrith looked around the room. No way out, not even the ceiling, no crevices or cracks or chinks to begin on. Diffenwell wanted her dead as a threat, that made sense, and to imprison her before the child was born, so did that. Yet, he was wholly Cymric, so it made no sense this child was only half Cymric. Osrith looked out of the window. The ship was being loaded with bags and ironware, and I would be on that, with my letter from Highwell, she thought bitterly as an oak tree clattered its upper branches against the stone wall. Too far to jump, nothing to act as a rope, and the scratching came again. Osrith did not need to be told twice. Oak was strong, even the spindly branches, but from her estimate, she would have to jump several feet to get hold of a bigger one, and they overlapped well enough that she should be able to climb. More than several feet, Osrith thought, as she leapt towards one of the forks of the tree. Her hand caught on dead leaves as she made to grip, which scored into her hands as she used her knees to hang on. There was a commotion below her. But, incredibly, no one on the side of the river had seen her. If she were to drop directly into the ship, Constantine's men could board and she could be with them. But Osrith was wrong. Someone had seen her, and that someone was climbing up the tree from the bottom, in his mouth a short knife. Diffenwell's intention, for that was who was climbing, could not be clearer. Osrith climbed down further, on a course that would bring her to him. She could not go back, and she was too high up to drop down, even if she wasn't pregnant. I would do that, if I were you, Osrith said. When he was in reach of her. I would kill me. There is nothing I can do about it. But you condemn my child too. Diffenwell, his pale golden hair shimmering in the autumn light, smiled softly, as he raised the knife. I do not want your child to die. Climb down with me and we can make other arrangements for your stay. But Osrith shook her head. Below them, Eswi and Phelim were in the quay, looking around, quite unconcerned that she was not with them. It seemed. Osrith looked back to her cousin. Diffenwell, let me go, she begged. Let me do what Constantine wants, let me fulfill my prior commitments. But the king of Strathclyde inched towards her more and held the blade at her neck. You will, then, vow to Strathclyde, he told her. Vow to your country, cousin. Be amongst us, fight with us. Keep your mother's memory alive. Below, Angus had joined the other two warriors, and was looking about him. Any minute, Osrith thought, someone will look up. Someone would see them. She forced her eyes back to Diffenwell. I will be in the position to vow to you, she told him, once I have done what I have promised I would. It matters not, you are Grioghair's son, you are Cymric, your mother and father, a union of Cymric and Pict. You are more than worthy of your crown, Lord King. than I or even my child could be. To whom would you be wed? Bring forth your own children to inherit Coelhen's legacy. And Diffenwell dropped the knife and leaned out to Osrith, reaching for her hand. Below, Eswe looked up, and up. You are your mother's daughter from all accounts, Diffenwell said. And I accept, oh, how I accept, Osrith, for you unwittingly brought back to me, by your marriage to my father's slave, Guthard, Caelule, Strathclyde. They are once again whole. I accept your vow to your homeland you are avenged. And Osrith did not know how it was that she lost her balance. She could have moved strangely as the tree blew in the brisk breeze, or mistook her distance from Diffenwell. She could never countenance what Eswe told her later, that Diffenwell had caught her wrist, causing her to topple. 1 minute, she was looking into kind, brilliant blue eyes. The next she was falling. But not for long. Branches caught her awkwardly, and at the same time, Eswe took her legs, bringing Osrith her grip. Above her, an arrow whistled, intended for whom, and by whom, Osrith did not know. She continued to climb, heart beating, as Eswe climbed beside her, and, nearing the bottom, Engus's strong arms carried her and placed her into the ship, which was already free of its moorings. How strange to see the capital of Strathclyde in the daytime. 3 small boats had left the palace in utter darkness 30 years before. Now, Constantine was fleeing again, not himself, but his 3 warriors, and Osrith, Felim, standing at the stern, shot back more arrows to try to deflect those which were coming after them, as Engus implored that they were his people and for the bastard Pitlander to try to miss them. We were coming to get you, Eswe said, in a quiet voice next to Osrith. Scrapes covered Osrith's hands and arms, and he held out a bowl of water in which strips of cloth had been soaking. Now will you leave it to us? And despite herself, despite the fact that Eswe was not Finoli and she was not with the people she truly loved, Osrith curled her head towards him and placed it on his shoulder. Yes, she agreed, her eyes closing, feeling safe enough to sleep, for she was to meet Hywel soon, and then she would be able to return, and have her child, hers, and Finan's,